How do we run code in JavaScript? Well, we assign variables and then we run functions, right? That's all we really do in a language. So take a look at the code over here. Every time we run a function, let's say if we call the sayMyName function, we add these brackets to it, and then we're able to execute that function or run it. The JavaScript engine is going to look at this and say, aha, here's a task for me. Tell me what to do, Mr. Function. And as soon as the JavaScript engine sees these brackets, it's going to create something called an execution context. But we'll get to that in a second. If we run this function, sayMyName is going to be run, which is going to return findName, which is going to return printName, which is going to return my name. All right, that's a pretty convoluted way of doing things, but if I run this, we see that it prints Andre Nagwe. So what is happening here? Well, when the JavaScript engine sees those brackets, it's going to say, oh, I'm going to run a function and create an execution context. So the first thing it does is create an execution context, sayMyName, and add this execution context onto the stack. Remember our call stack, right? And then it tries to run this function and sees that, oh, this function is calling another function. So I'm going to create a new execution context because I'm going to see these brackets. That's called findMyName, and there we have it, another item that gets pushed onto the stack. And then that function, once again, the JavaScript engine is going to see, oh, here's another bracket, pair of brackets, print name, let's run this function. And then this function, after it's created its own execution context, is going to return the string Andre Nagwe, which gets returned to findMyName, which gets returned to sayMyName. And then eventually the call stack all gets popped off, and we return onto the screen Andre Nagwe. It's really weird saying my own name while doing this. Next time I'm going to pick a different name. So if we take a look back onto our code, this should make sense. We're adding items onto the call stack, which we've talked about before, but this time I've introduced to you this idea of execution context. Now, before we get into exactly what this execution context means, I may have lied to you. The diagram that we just saw isn't 100% accurate because the base execution context that runs is called the global execution context. This is what I mean. Initially, our JavaScript engine is going to create a global execution context. We don't see this, it's underneath the hood, but it's saying, hey, here's the JavaScript file for you, just start reading it for me. And on top of that, that's when we start adding sayMyName, then findMyName, then printName. And then eventually, as these execution contexts get popped off, the last thing that remains is the global execution context. And when the final line of our code runs and we're done with the JavaScript engine, this is going to get popped off the stack. So just from what we've learned, if I tell you, whenever code is run in JavaScript, it is run inside of an execution context. Is that a true statement or a false statement? Well, it's true, right? Anytime we run code in JavaScript, it's always going to be part of an execution context. That is, it's part of global or inside of some function that we called. Now, we're going to get back to this topic a little bit deeper later on. But if we take a look at the global execution context, remember that's the very first item on the stack. The first thing the JavaScript engine does is to create this global execution context, and it gives you two things. First thing is a global object, and the other thing is the this keyword in JavaScript. Everybody's favorite topic, right? The this keyword in JavaScript. Well, we have an entire video series on this, so stay tuned. But to start things off, global execution context gives us these two things right off the bat when the JavaScript engine starts up. So let's test this assumption. If what I just told you is correct, that means I can just give an empty file to, let's say, the browser, and I should have a global object and the this keyword already defined without me having to do anything. So let's go to some code and test this out. All right, I've created the most basic website ever. We have an HTML file that simply says, hello, and a script tag that has script.js that is completely empty. Now, if I refresh here and run this, based on what I just told you, I should have, well, the this keyword. And look at that. I do have access to the this keyword, even though there's absolutely nothing in my JavaScript file. And I should also have access to the global object. And in the browser, the global object is window. So I get these two things, the this keyword and window, without even writing a piece of JavaScript because the browser has created a global execution context for me. And you might be asking yourself, hold on, are these the same thing? Well, let's test that out. This equals window. Is that true? Yep, that's true. That's the very first step that the JavaScript engine does for us. The JavaScript engine is going to create these two objects. And these two objects are going to equal to one another. For now, at least. And by the way, if we're using something like Node, the global object wouldn't be window. Instead, it'll be called global. And to this global object, we can assign variables, right? If I go back to our example and I clear this, if I say variable a equals true, or let's just do Teddy, if I go to the window object now, I open it up, I see that I've added a variable to my global object, that is a equals Teddy. And I can add functions and I can add different things to this global object. So once we have done this, what we call a creation phase in our JavaScript engine, we then have a second phase. And that second phase is called the execution phase, where you actually run your code. Now, we're going to expand on this a little bit, but to review, when code is run on the JavaScript engine, a global execution context is created. And when you run a function, a new execution context is added, a function execution context, and we start running our code until everything gets popped off the stack and all of our code is run. All right, I think you're sick and tired of me saying global execution context over and over, but hopefully this made sense to you because in the next video, we have another difficult term to cover. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.